So, according to an MLB official who spoke to Jesse Rogers at ESPN, the league is searching for a way to accomplish some noble goals. There's, I think, like 3 of them. They want to increase the amount of action per game because you could argue that even though I think one of the things that you and I have been talking about off air is that strikeouts really don't have any less value than other outs. We act like,
an out's an out.
Right. Like, we don't track the number of ground ball outs somebody makes or fly outs, but we track the number of strikeouts somebody has because that's somehow worse than anything else. But it really isn't. But lots of strikeouts in a game means there's just lots of guys walking up to the plate, not hitting the ball, and then going back and sitting down. They want to restore the prominence of starting pitchers. And that's definitely because when they're only ever going 5 or 6 innings into the game, because of the way we talk about them, we don't talk about them without being impressive. You have to go deep into games to be impressive.
I think you just made me think of something when you said that because baseball needs stars, right? And so if everybody's mitigated to being a 4 and 5 inning pitcher, and there are no really distinguished pitchers or fewer of them, like there's no more star pitchers. You don't go to the game to watch.
You have to change your definition of what a star pitcher is.
And the matchups that used to be so a big matchup between 2 big pitchers, Randy Johnson and Greg Maddux,
a Titanic battle in the AL West between the Rangers and the Astros, Scherzer versus Verlander. You would have that kind of storied pitching matchup.
So I think the pitchers themselves want to remain, and that was something that was said. I think Lugo came out and said we all want to go 6 innings. By the way, something he's been having a little trouble doing lately.
Right, and part of the reason they also are thinking about doing it, paradoxically, I think at least when you first hear it, is to reduce the prevalence of starting pitcher injuries, which is weird if you think about, so we want to mandate them to throw
more pitches and so that they can have fewer injuries. No,
now,
because they're going to go easier now. They're not going to try so hard. Yeah, right.
Now, granted, this does have some caveats because immediately the starter can only be removed from the game before reaching the 6-inning minimum if he throws 100 pitches, gives up 4 or more earned runs, or gets injured, which is pretty much all of the reasons why a guy is normally removed before the 6th inning.
So what it strikes me as, so it's the 5th inning, and things are a little tight, and the pitcher has, thrown 81 pitches or something like that, and it's a 3-2 game, something like that. So he hasn't given up the 4 runs, but the manager knows that, the bases are loaded
it's
now.
Early in the season.
He wants to get this guy out of there, and maybe they'll limit it won't be 100 pitches early in the season. Maybe it'll be 80 pitches in the first month or something like that. They'll fix it with something like that. So I think that's really the place where you're worried about, okay, I want him to leave the starter in. He can't go and just get him because I know he's going to get killed if he keeps pitching, saying, look, you're going to lose your DH or something's going to happen. And then they haven't really talked about what the penalty might be.
Right. Now, obviously, I think it's interesting because at the end of the day, what MLB is saying is they're not happy with what the current product of the game is totally. The pace of change is good. People like the faster gameplay, but I think there is something to be said for the old people going, you know what, the guys strike out too much these days. Because it's not necessarily worse baseball, but it is a worse product as a viewer.
Yeah, right. It's less interesting to watch for the same reasons we talked about why they went to liberalize the stolen base, the base pitches over to the first base, pitchers going to first, and bigger bases to try to have more outs on the bases, so they'll try more stolen bases. And so that's better than a strikeout, I think they feel, from an action standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is something that's a far, far away from being ever, implemented, but it is something major.
They seem serious about it.
They're thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be interesting. I think we're going to see a lot of changes. They're trying to tinker with the game, and I'm glad that they're willing to tinker with the game to try and improve the product, because maybe it's because I play video games, and specifically online video games, that I'm used to a governing body coming in going, okay, we're changing the rules of the game. It's going to play a little differently now, and it's not going to play exactly how you remember. It's like, that's pretty commonplace for video games. But for sports, rule changes have to come by after years of deliberation. So I think the idea that, hey, we can make changes to the game to try and improve it, and it might result in a slightly different appearing game than we had before, isn't necessarily a bad thing.
And I think that's a great point, and that there's not going to be as many situations if they do implement this rule, because when you think about it, if a guy's got 100 pitches in the 4th or 5th inning, okay, he's going to be out of the game anyway for the most part. It's only going to be on those situations where it's like, there's three,
And it'll lead to
less
exciting
than 4
And
runs.
it'll lead to exciting moments because now you'll be in the 5th inning. He'll have 97 pitches, and he gets another out. Now there's 2 outs, but he's not at 100 pitches yet. They got to
You
leave.
can't take him out.
Right.
Well, you can take him out, but you're maybe going to give up something. You give up your DH.
Right.
I don't want to do that.
I don't want to do that, so let's leave him in there. Let's see if he can get the guy. That's going to be a fun moment for the fans and everybody watching.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea that won't have as big. Like, it sounds like it's a big, huge thing.
Kind of like the pitch clock sounded like a big, huge thing, and then was like, oh wait, this really doesn't have an impact on anything other than making it better for the fans.
I'll just, you mentioned the pitch clock, and when I was at that Sabre conference, I heard the same thing, that we talk about all the time, that I had said is that, yeah, the shift, banning the shift I didn't want them to do it, but it doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. The pitch clock doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. So I think these rule changes have kind of, become, part of the game now. We just accept them for what they are.
Right. And one of the things that does happen is the more often that you do make rule changes, the more the fans and the players are used to there being slight tweaks more often. So people don't complain as much when there are year-to-year iterations. And you're not always going to get it right. Now, the nice thing is there's not, you're not going to deal with video game-esque problems of balancing. You're just the rules of the game itself. But
right.
I think that, you're going to see this with catchers coming up. Catchers are right now evaluated a bit on framing, which goes away if we move to automated balls and strikes. So that's an entire way we measure the game right now that's going to be gone because of a rule change.
I think we're going to do that for our next episode. We'll talk about
Possibly.
the future of catchers, actually. That's kind of something that we got on mind. So nice job there. And, so the rule changes that we both agree that, good that they're tinkering, good that they're trying stuff. I think the automatic balls and strikes thing is something that is coming. They're going to probably end up with a challenge system. So good on MLB for continuing to try to find different ways to make it better. A couple of interesting things this week that I read that I thought was interesting that I hadn't thought about. And Mike Petrello, who writes for Major League Baseball, wrote an article about outfield defense, saying that it's made it harder than ever to be a successful hitter because the outfield play is better than it's ever been. And I don't think I had really been thinking about outfield play.
I was trying to I was trying to speak to this, yesterday when we were watching the Mets game on Saturday. I was talking about the outfield defense is so good that the available places to get hits is so much less. And when you have a particularly bad defender, it's an invisible detractor on your team because you as a fan can't really tell that there's a guy on your team that isn't getting the balls he should.
Right, and we see it, you take it for granted because guys are positioned well because they got the car in the back pocket. They know how they're going to play the guy, how the pitcher's going to pitch the guy so that you can be. And so this, not that they didn't have that before, but they're even better analytically to understanding what the tendencies are going to be.
Well, now you've got guys that are better at reading the ball off the bat, arguably, more athletic, better trained with better data.
And they throw harder and they run faster.
Right. The only thing that's harder is the guys hit the ball harder.
Right. So I think we saw plays today, a ball that I think maybe would have been a hit 15 or 20 years ago that this guy ran down and caught at the fence and caught it in stride, made it look pretty,
and it wasn't that
pretty
there
easy.
weren't great plays,
But you expect them now.
Right, but it's more that the average is just so much higher.
Right.
We when we think about baseball from back in the day, we think about the best players because those are the guys that stick out in our memory. But then we create a league that was only filled with them and not filled with all of the guys that actually played, who were Major League Baseball players, but there were guys that were just kind of a good Major League Baseball players, kind of average, and then kind of bad because there's always some guys that aren't very good playing every season, that aren't having good years, that can't field great and aren't supposed to be there.
And I think it's almost easier to think about the Major League outfielders who we think's defense is weak as opposed to which ones are strong. The ones that are weak are the ones that stand out now because everybody else is strong.
and what we think of what traditionally makes people weak, if you watch a Phillies broadcast anytime,
the same thing.
Nick Castellanos hasn't made an error in forever. Yet if you look at advanced defensive metrics, he's terrible because, the reason he doesn't make any errors is because he doesn't get to any balls, so he's never making any difficult plays. He's only ever catching balls that are basically hit
right. If
you
don't catch the ball and you field it on a hop, you haven't really helped your team that much.
Right. This is something that we as Met fans, this is kind of something I was saying with Vientos at third base, is that he doesn't necessarily make that many errors because there's balls that he should be making attempts on that he's not getting to because his range is poor. And so that's something that, as a fan, even, we who like to think of ourselves as educated baseball fans, we can't see that on TV.
No, you can't. And so, you add to the outfield defense, and I read also something this week that you won't really talk about how many different pitchers hitters must know now. So in 1941, Ted Williams faced 74 pitchers. Okay, so now we're 80 years later. Mookie Betts faced last year 297 pitchers. Okay, so you got to know 74 guys if you're Ted Williams. Mookie Betts has to know 297. There's no way.
And also think about this. Of those 74 guys that Williams faced that season, how many of those were guys that he had faced the previous season? And how many of those would be guys that he would go on to face the next season? I bet 30 to 40%, maybe higher.
Bill James said 50 out of the 74, let's say. Then this was hypothetical. He made the comment. You would know 50 of the 74 pitchers. Today, you know 50 of the 297 pitchers.
And how many of those 297 pitchers, literally, he never sees again in his career? He sees them that one time in that one game in that one season, and then never again. So, that's got to be insane to try and grapple with, because it's just like, okay, and that speaks to how good these hitters are, that they eat up guys like that.
And how it's still that hard to hit, and these guys are that good; they're able to overcome all that kind of stuff.
Right, they still hit, and I think that's why we've been. I was talking last week about how it's kind of the Cy Young race that nobody wants to win here in the National League, and unfortunately, one of the guys that was really in that race, Hunter Green, has now gone to the IL, and he probably isn't going to be back the rest of the season, which really reduces the number of active participants in that race.
Yeah, I don't think Hunter Green really had a super great shot. He was just mentioned as a candidate.
He was in the top 3 candidates.
I think it's really hard to win a Cy Young for a lousy team.
I think Sale is now really in there.
I think Imanaga is still sort of on the periphery.
He's on the periphery. I'd say Glasnow's on the IL and on the periphery. I think
Zach Wheeler, but
Zach Wheeler's probably the other guy, just because he's got good advanced metrics, and he's got the name reputation where I think he'd be the other guy that's going to kind of compete with Sale, because name is a big part of it, especially when guys aren't having stellar years. If you're a guy like, last year Justin Steele had an unbelievable season, you can get yourself up there when you're going 16-8 and pitch into a 2-something ERA in the second half. Now, nobody's doing that this year, so when you're 10-5 with a 2.9 ERA, you're not going to get Cy Young talk like some guys are kind of pitching right now.
And I think, it's particularly hard because a lot of these pitchers that are vying for the Cy Young, you mentioned Chris Sale. In the American League, I mentioned Seth Lugo before. So Lugo's got 159 innings this year. It's the most he's ever thrown in his career. Chris Sale, who leads the National League, I think, in strikeouts and has, well over 140 or 40 innings, he's coming off surgery, and you just wonder, when are these guys going to break?
Well, we were wondering that with the Dodgers, and now Glasnow's on the IL. That was something we thought was coming for a long time, and it finally sort of happened. So I'm sure that's kind of a fear, because, if you're the Dodgers, you're like, oh, you're going into Sunday here, and you're like, oh, we're
well, they won today.
Right, but we're only 2.5 games up on the Padres. When did that happen? Like, that's got to be the nice thing if you're the Brewers. If you're the Brewers, you're like, okay, we're 72-52. We're 11 games up on the Cardinals. The Cardinals have to play at a rate that there's no reason to ever expect them to start playing at that rate.
I was going to make those points. So here's my take. All the teams that are below 500 right now, not even at 500, because I don't know there are any teams at 500, but you're 62-63 or something like that, and you got 37 games left in the season. In order for you to win 84 games or 85 games, right, to give yourself a chance, you got to go like 24 and 11 or 24 and 13 the rest of the way in order to get there. You haven't done that all season. Why would you start now?
Right, teams like the Blue Jays, the Tigers, the Rays,
out.
All of those teams are out. The Rangers
out. The Rangers are out. I pronounced them dead.
The Mariners are hanging on.
They're over 500, so I give them a chance.
64 and 61, but they almost have an easier path to win their division than win a wild card
They're not
spot.
catching the Astros.
If they're not catching the Astros, they're not getting a wild card
I don't think
spot.
they will. I think that's why. I think because they won't catch the Astros.
Right.
And I think the Mets, similarly, like they're over 500 by a few games, they have a tall order because
they're at least right there with the Braves right now for that.
That's the only chance they might have.
Right, because it looks like the Padres and the Diamondbacks are the teams that forgot how to lose right now.
And even if they come down to earth, and the Mets are sure hoping that because
they're
they're going to play the Padres and the Diamondbacks on the next road trip.
That could be something that changes fortune. If you're the Mets and you somehow magically remember how to win and you go and you have a great road trip.
And that's why they still have a chance. But I think if they're over 500 enough to say, well, they don't have to have a miracle. Whereas if you're like 262 and 63 or around 500,
if you're the Cardinals and the Cubs,
you need a miracle
Pirates,
now. You need a miracle.
Right, then the Pirates need a miracle. The Reds need a miracle. You're 5.5 games out, but your team just has to start playing at such a crazy pace.
And they haven't done it all year.
Right.
The Tigers haven't done it. So the teams that don't need miracles that are still fighting, right? And there's not that many left now because we've really seen that sort of shake out where, okay, the Phillies, they're going to win the division. The Brewers are going to win the division. The Dodgers and the Padres, that's actually a race now, so I don't think I would give it to the Dodgers and the Diamondbacks. So there are your teams, and the other teams are fighting for that spot, the Mets and the Braves probably for the other playoff spot. All the other teams, I think, have no chance.
And I think the American League East race is going to be the most interesting race of the season because the penalty for losing that race is brutal right now. Because it looks like it's going to end up where you're the number 1 seed and you got to skip the first round of the playoffs, or you're in the wild card round.
And that's going to be a tough wild card round,
right?
Because you're going to end up. Look, we've said at the beginning of the
season,
season,
you're going to end up in the first spot.
You could
playing the Astros,
playing the Astros, or maybe you could play the Guardians. Although
the Guardians are going to be above. They're going to be. I
think the Twins are going to catch the Guardians.
No. Oh yeah, because the Twins have basically been one of the best
Guardians.
Teams in baseball. So you could end up playing the other. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
So I think so you've got the Royals that are standing right there because they're in a much better place than are the Mariners, obviously. Because if you give the Yankees or the Orioles, one of them's going to make it, one of them not.
Right.
The Guardians and the Twins right now, you'd say those two teams have a pretty good chance of making the playoffs, either as a division champion.
It would require a collapse on one of their
Which
parts.
can happen.
Which can happen.
There's still 30, 38, 37 games left. And then and in the West, you can't give it to the Mariners. The Royals actually have a much better record than the Mariners.
The Royals are in a commanding position.
And they're better than the Red Sox, who are the other team. They're really going to be battling.
But the Red Sox are probably the Red Sox are the team that's sort of lurking there under the radar. That if things break right and they play well down the stretch, they very much could slip into the playoffs.
It would be a pain in the neck to play in the playoffs, and the Yankees, and will have a very interesting week coming up. They called up Jason Dominguez finally, and Yankee fans have been clamoring for this guy.
After he was so good last year when he came up.
And I guess they're hoping. I wouldn't want to count on the guy for too much because that's putting a lot on a guy who's really just getting himself back going after injury. But I think that he is going to definitely help them.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed this week that Arias is leading the league in hitting for the National League in hitting for the Padres, and if he won the batting title this year, he would be. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I didn't look it up. He would be the first guy in Major League history to win the batting title for 3 different teams in 3 seasons.
Well, yeah, I can't imagine.
Who would be trading the batting champion two times in a row? But that's what happened to this guy.
Well, now he's actually behind right now.
Oh, was he? Because I checked. I thought it was.
As of today, Ozuna just passed him. Ozuna's hitting 308. Arias is down to 306. Right now, it's pretty much just the two of them.
Right.
They're the only two guys above 300.
If I had to bet between the two of them the rest of the season,
I'm going to guess it's Arias.
I would bet Arias actually to do that. So I think that's interesting. And we saw the Pirates fall out of the race because they lost 10 in a row, so that kind of took care of them. The Angels are now tied for last place with the Oakland Athletics.
I mean, it says this. If you needed proof that hitting is down in baseball, Francisco Lindor, who's hitting 264 after a dreadful start to the season, is 25th in the National League in hitting.
Oh, that's nuts. That a 264 average would be in the top 25 in the league. I mean, wow.
Just think that's how.
Is this 1968? Is it happening all over again?
And this is why baseball is. So this is one of the things we talked about is, I think trading a tackier ball for a reduced height on the mound is something that could maybe work to help reduce pitching injuries, allow the pitchers to generate more spin, which is allow them to throw bigger breaking pitches, so they're going to be able to be more effective that way. But they're not going to be as hard on their arm, and hopefully it'll get averages up a little bit because guys can hit for contact a little bit more because they don't have to sell their souls just to try and hit the ball.
There is a school of thought that because the balls are a little slippery, the pitcher has to grip it a little tighter, and that causes more stress on the arm when they throw it. Whereas if it was tackier, they'd be able to hold it with a little bit, less tension, so to speak. I don't know how valid that is. I think it's an interesting point that was made.
And the other thing that I do think is it's interesting looking here at the seasons that Luis Arias is having, and he's hitting 306. His on base is 337. His slugging is 379.
Yeah.
So what?
Not very good, I know.
But it goes past that. So he's got 3 home runs. He's got 23 doubles. So and he's got 64 runs. But then you've got Ozuna, who's got 23 doubles, 78 runs because he's got 36 homers. So I'm just like, what is Arias really doing?
Well, and that's been the complaint with the guy the whole time.
Right.
Is that all he does is get on base and by hitting most of the time and not necessarily any other way.
Right, and I think it's interesting because we were watching the Pete Rose documentary, or there's some docu-series that we watched the first episode, and they're extolling the virtues of Pete Rose by Pete Rose, or at least according to him. And it's interesting thinking about how valuable it's like. Okay, well, in a different game, that guy is much more valuable. In a game that's played much more station to station, where runs are manufactured with a lot more regularity, having a guy that gets a lot of hits, regardless of how far they go, is valuable. But in a Major League Baseball game in which there's 3 true outcomes all over the place, having a guy that kind of just slaps singles, I think doesn't. What is that really? Because it's he slaps a single and then the next 3 guys strike out.
Well, I think you said it when you said it about Arias going. It's okay. It's great that you hit 300 every year and all that stuff. You should have an on-base average of 400. All of a sudden, you're so much more valuable. You're scoring more runs. You're more on base. But when you don't do anything other than it's like a guy would you rather have a guy who gets on base 40% of the time who bats 290, or a guy who bats 310 who gets on base 36% of the time or 35%?
Ketel Marte is this exact thing. He's hitting 298, but he's got a 370 on base, so he's on base so much more, so he's scoring more.
Who would you rather have at your second baseman?
Right, he's creating so many more runs than Arias. Arias is in here as a first baseman.
Is he really playing first base? I know that Cronenworth, I don't know who they played at first base. I can't believe it they play him at first base. Talk about giving up power at the corner position. You got to check that. That's really something. So, the week has some interesting series coming up, and I wanted to point a couple of them out. And the Orioles, who are fighting with the Yankees, are going to come and play the Mets in New York for 3 games. And that could really send both teams one way or the other, actually, in the basis of that series, I think, depending on how it goes, obviously. The Red Sox are going to play the Astros. The Astros are red hot, by the way. They've won 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 11. They're like 11 games over 500. All of a sudden, and their pitching strikes everybody out. They're amazing strikeouts consistently by all of their starting pitchers. Framber's kind of come around. I think the Astros are hitting their stride just at the right time. And then the Twins are going to go to San Diego, and that's a pretty big series because they have been chasing down. The Twins have the Guardians, and the Padres obviously have been playing really well. So
and they're chasing down the Dodgers. So one of those teams is sort of going to run into a wall in their quest for taking over the division crown.
And then after that series, comes up, those series comes up. They go for the weekend series, and I thought it's really good because the Phillies and the Braves are going to play 3 games, which is really
next weekend.
Right, going into next weekend. I think they play during the week, actually. So talk about a really good series. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday they play.
That's a big series for Atlanta because you've got the Mets are playing a good opponent in Baltimore.
The Phillies could bury Atlanta, though. Right, they could bury the division.
Right, they could bury the division and basically going into September have it all wrapped up in them. They're like, okay, we just have to make sure we're playing good and nobody gets hurt the last month of the season.
And then after the Phillies are done with the Braves, they get to play they go to Kansas City and play the Royals. So they've got a tough stretch coming up. The Diamond, and then Houston will go to Baltimore and play the Orioles after the Orioles play the Mets. So we got some really good series between good teams, the Diamondbacks and the Red Sox, also this week in a meaningful interleague series with 2 teams that probably barely know each other, the Diamondbacks and the Red Sox.
Right, you're starting to get a lot of series with sort of playoff implications because now when teams slide, if you slide to 7-8 games back in a week, you might be kind of done.
Right, right. And so it renders some of the other series, that come up, random series, the Tigers and the White Sox, nobody's watching. The Reds and the Pirates, nobody's
The
watching.
Rays and the Athletics.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the Rays are done, as well. So the Athletics somehow got 37,000 people to show up at the Coliseum on Sunday for that moribund team because the reason was it was the last time the Giants were ever going to play the Athletics in the Coliseum. So all the Giant fans
showed up.
Let's look at this ballpark before it goes away. So that's
nostalgic for us.
That's the reason there. So yeah, I think that you're getting some really tight games with 35. I think 1 week will make the difference, right? Like by next week we could really see. Oh well, now these guys have really.
You're not
going
to be able to clinch a wild card in the next week, but you will definitely be able to eliminate yourself from contention.
Particularly if you don't show up. So yeah, great stuff. Really looking forward to it.